No, didn't do that right.
Australia, everywhere, spread across the world. So the song Kumbuleka is a song that I sing and the song that I wrote is a dedication to everybody that has family who's all over the world. So it says Kumbuleka, we miss home.
Hello, good morning. I think we should get started now and not lose too much time. I know that we've got quite a tight schedule for the amazing speakers and session we've got for you today. So welcome to those of you who've been able to wake up on time and join us for this web session. Welcome also to those of you who'll be catching this later. So my name is Rori Sabina, and I am the National Coordinator for the Civic Tech Innovation Network. And my role is actually quite simple. It's really just to open the session and then hand over. But before we do that, I am instructed usually to share a few slides and instructions. So let me do that now quickly. Hang on a second here while I get back to this. Here we go. So as I've mentioned, I'm Rori Sabina. I'll be handing over soon to our wonderful host, Lesley Williams, and I'll introduce her shortly. We'll then have panel discussions and lots of interaction and time for that. So we look forward to today's session. We welcome you to use the chat function in the Zoom, really just more for social and technical interaction. We do ask you, our audience, to please pop into the Q&A any specific discussion points that you want to raise with today's panel. And then Nati will be upset if I don't mention that you should please note the handles and social media stuff that's there on the screen. I'm very bad on social media, so I'm not the best advocate. But do follow us on Twitter at Civic Tech Africa, and we do make sure that we post everything on our website. After every session, there'll always be a recording, an article, and any follow-up. So please do carry on with us. Event etiquette, basically don't be rude, participate, have fun. We put out these sessions on what we think are topical issues for people who are interested in civic tech. For us, that's very much people who are interested in using technology in the widest possible terms. It could be methodological, high tech, low tech, but for public good, for social purpose. And I think that's who we tend to convene. And those are the conversations we try to have, hopefully to inspire us and perhaps to even give us creative ideas and connections for how we do things differently. So the conversation on food tech is very purposefully about that. I'm going to stop screen share because the next action was to introduce our speaker, Lesley, which I'd like to do. But before we do that, I just want to invite everybody to check in with a combined activity. And I'm going to ask you all to go to your chat. So you can click on the chat button at the bottom of your screens, including the panelists. Panelists, just make sure you check the option that says all panelists and attendees. And I'm going to ask you, in a word, you know, if we were in the last days of the last days, and that's a scary thing to say given that we are in very strange times, and you could have one food, it's going to be the last thing you ever eat. Could you just type into your chat what that would be? So the one food, last days, one thing you can eat or drink. Oh, somebody stole mine already. Ah, mohodu, that's a good one. Mm. Ooh, people are onto the calamaris and the, oh, lamb chops, that's good. Okay, so lots of good foods, and in a way, it's a light. We're talking food security, so obviously this is the last day, so we had the luxury to think what we really would love to have. Obviously, there's some seriousness as well to our topic today, which is the reality that for so many, there is so little, and we're going to get into what some of the ideas and thoughts are about that. Fortunately, that's not my job, so I'm going to go back to share screen and introduce you to our host for the day. Oops. Our host for today's session is a person I consider to be one of my leaders and a friend, Lesley Donna Williams. We're not going to read the whole bios. They are available on the website. But I think I'd just like to highlight that Lesley is the CEO of the Tshimologong Precinct that many of us know. She's also recently named a panel member of the Gauteng Provincial Government's 4IR panel. And that's hopefully going to be an important space where they'll be looking at issues of how to make the digital transformation inclusive. And that's an important conversation. She's also a board member, what we call the reference group for the Civic Tech Innovation Network. And so she's my boss in that sense. But most importantly for this session, her most important qualification is she's a certified foodie. So here's somebody who loves food and probably has a vested interest in making sure that we secure it into the future. And so with those few words, I'd just like to hand over to our host for today, Lesley, and thank you for taking this on.
Thank you, Geshi. And Geshi is absolutely right. I'm not showing up today as a practitioner of dealing with food security, but I'm showing up more as someone who absolutely loves food. And, you know, for me, there's like such a mismatch in the fact that I love food, I'm a foodie, I study ingredients and the different blends and experiences on my palate. And on the other extreme, there's food insecurity in our country, and it just does not make sense to me. So I put on a question on Facebook on the 20th of July, where I was basically highlighting that Oxfam said that South Africa has become a hotspot for hunger during COVID. And I put a whole lot of assumptions behind it, and I was quite encouraged by the response. on that social media post. I had a few inboxes, DMs, including from Rori, and to a large extent, people were challenging me and saying, like, I'm asking the wrong question, which also sent me on a journey for the past 2 months. I also then realized that I hosted a conversation around food, and I was calling it Food 2.0 in 2016. And Kevin was on that panel as well. So I'm quite curious to see what has shifted, if anything, in the past 4 years. So some of my selfish questions that I'm holding right now, and I'll just put it out there, and some of them I see as contradictions, but maybe they're dualities. So it's kind of like this mismatch, like I said, between a foodie and food insecurity. And then there's obesity in our land, but there's also malnutrition. There's food wastage, but there's hunger. And then also, like, there is this avenue around like indigenous wisdom, indigenous knowledge, and like how does that fit in with modern tech solutions? You know, so there's all these dualities and seeming contradictions that I'm holding within me that I hope that we surface today. The other kind of questions that I'm holding, and by the way, audience, please, I need your support. Drop in your questions in the Q&A section, because like I said, I'm a layman on this topic, so I need your also deep thinking questions. But this is just to stimulate some of what I'm holding. So again, is the idea of farm to plate romanticized? Is that just a concept I picked up in the development world, living in London, visiting San Francisco? Is it for these developed nations, or is it for us also? How do we like bust the myths and highlight facts? So again, a question I'm having is like, is Monsanto the evil corporation? Or how do we need to frame our thinking around seeds and population growth? Other questions I'm holding final to is, will we achieve social development, achieve the social development goal of zero food hunger by 2030? And finally, who's the owner of this problem at all? Like, why are we even at this table? So with that, I will introduce people that I hold in very, very high regard. Two of them I know for a while. The one I was introduced to last week. So the background, or the intersections of which I know Kevin, ranges from, I mean, he's an absolute serial entrepreneur. So financial services, the culture industry, particularly jazz. He had a software company, or has, you can clarify that. And then also this link between food, community, and culture are some of the topics we've engaged on. With Rori, who I've also known for a few months, years now, and I've also been quite curious about the journey of his career. But what I've seen as what I've decided is the common link, so you can also clarify that Rori, is just around look at deep issues around systems change. Like at all topics that I've seen him bring before, it's always about systems change. So from party politics to radio talk show host to, you know, research and development around high impact innovative solutions, that deep thread around system change. And then Namhla, I was introduced to last week. In fact, our link is via one of my mentors. And I just have no idea how I've not met you before, Namhla. Like, to me, you are the absolute food queen. So the fact that you've actually gone and gotten degrees around food technology in both South Africa, in the US, courses in Paris. So there's really this both academic but also a pragmatic approach to food, having operated as a food technologist in multiple corporates, managed a farm, and then also your advisory and consulting skills to farmers. So I believe we have the right people around the table. So thank you for joining me, gentlemen and lady. And yeah, let's take a deep dive. So my first question is to Namhla, but guys, please feel to build on it. Please give me, we're not going to get stuck in definitions. Today is not about that, but please frame what food security is and means to you. So Namhla, you're on mute.
Hello. Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. So for me, food security, the first thing that comes to mind is the access to the food. And so basically what we have now, we keep talking about your food security and food insecurity. And I'm at a point where I'm like, you know, South Africa, we are very secure when it comes to food. The challenges that we're sitting with is the accessibility to the food. So that's just to sum it up for me, that when you talk food security is about how do we access the food? How do we get, an equitable distribution of the food to, to the people?
Thank you. Kevin, food sovereignty, it looks like that's something that's showing up in the activist spaces, but what is that?
Well, basically, I mean, when we look at food, food, yeah, okay, here's a slice of bread, do you have food? Yes, you might be able to fill your stomach with something, but does it match other criteria as well? Does it meet your health needs? So is it healthy for you? Does it contain funny chemicals and pollutants that you might not want to eat, that might harm you? Is it culturally appropriate as well? Are we all forced to eat white bread, or do I eat my cultural rice, for example? Do I have access to that? So it starts to ask a number of different questions in terms of, well, what does food mean to people? And it's more than just filling someone's stomach. It's addressing many other needs as well. And when you talk about health as well, it's macronutrients, a good balance of protein, carbs, fats, healthy fats, but it's also micronutrients. Is there magnesium or calcium or so on and so forth? Everything you need to be healthy as a human in there. Microorganisms as well,
Awesome. Thank you. Rory, also, what is your understanding of the problem, and what is our blind spot with regard to solution building?
Well, yeah, at least I think one of them is, I think we tend to approach these issues from our places of preference, as opposed to, focusing on the contradictions, right? So all systems are the way that they are because they've settled into a particular equilibrium based on certain compromises that have been reached based on the various contradictions that underpin them. And I think that in many ways we tend to, come at the solution not focusing on where the contradictions are so that we can unlock the contradictions and shift the system in a particular way. We tend to focus on like what our preference is, right? So, if my preference, for instance, is on optimizing on, the demand side, I'll just speak about that and not actually understand some of the constraints around, well, if I'm going to optimize for demand, then how do I make sure that that demand is self-sustaining? How do I fund that demand and that distribution? If I optimize on the supply side and I optimize solely for profit, how do I make sure then that we achieve optimal accessibility? If I optimize on the sustainability side, how do I make sure that the sustainable practices don't lock out, or that the sustainable practices, first of all, are scalable, but that in achieving scale, they don't actually move us out of the realm of affordability for the majority. So I think, our sense is that probably the primary thing is that we tend to focus in our little corners, and at least from my perspective, where I'm coming from is, I think we're not focused enough on market-based solutions to the issue of food security. And as a result, we don't have a naturally accretive, whatever solutions we come up with aren't naturally accretive. In other words, they don't self-perpetuate. And so we're constantly then coming back to the same problem of being stuck.
Thank you. Just to build on that, Namhla, from the work that you're doing, and I'd love to also hear, like, what is Food Forward's lessons during the pandemic, or that we're still in? But also, like, is there anyone that's convening to bring the whole system to have this holistic view that Rory's speaking to?
Lesley, I don't think we have a holistic view, and this is where I think, as part of our conversation today, it's things that we need to address. That there is a shortage in terms of data collection. So we don't have the data, for starters, and we also need to understand, from an accessibility point of view, in order for us to reach where we need to reach, we need that data. And it needs to be in a centralized, areas or a centralized point. We don't have that at the moment, and it needs to come through heavily from a technology point of view. And so if I look at, you know, our learnings in terms of Food Forward South Africa, is that we've had quite a lot of, you know, requests in terms of, you know, in terms of supplying food or donating food in the different areas. But there were areas that, you know, that still could, you know, we couldn't reach because we didn't have the info, you know, in many cases. So open data is crucial to allow us for, you know, for planning and collaboration, and also the information sharing, and to just better understand the local environment. So yeah.
Thanks, Namhla. Kevin, there's been a whole bunch of initiatives popping up during lockdown, from citizens taking action to NGOs, just to like make sure people are fed. But how do we organize better? And Namhla spoke about open data, but what are you seeing, and what are some of the actions that you're taking?
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's actually a very important point. You know, the data. I mean, it was such a struggle during lockdown that, you know, mapping out who needs food. You know, I know some people receive 3 or 4 parcels in a week, whereas others couldn't receive anything. So there was this great discord, and one thing, you know, I found quite upsetting was that there were relief, you know, a relief package for small farmers, for producers, and on the other hand, everyone was sourcing food, but, you know, ended up sourcing from the larger producers because there was no sort of contact, you know, for all these small producers, even though they're receiving, you know, funding or relief funding. So what ended up happening is they still had food that they ended up giving away or dumping or not knowing what to do with. And it's all these, it is a systemic issue that we're looking at. You know, I've been around in this industry for almost 10 years and tried different things, you know, but ultimately it's a systemic issue that we're actually trying to address. So the struggles we had during lockdown, of course, going out, trying to help people and trying to organize the small producers to actually assist better, really, you know, really highlighted the issues to a greater level. What we started doing in more recently, and even started, you know, during the more severe lockdown periods was yeah, how do we collate data? We can bring different databases together, so we're trying to work on those aspects. But one of the big issues with that, of course, is privacy. What agreements were reached when you collected the data? Definitely bringing data together is very important. We have to address the privacy concerns, and the beauty of doing that is that you wouldn't have to go back to that person and collect data over and over again, which is what's been happening actually. You know, we work with small producers who in the last, I don't know, 2-3 months, some of them have been going through continuous, hey, can you answer the survey? Can you tell us what you're doing? You know, every week sometimes, you know. So yeah, those are some of the issues we're facing at the moment. Yeah.
So just to unpack, who is that we? I know, like, from conversations I've had with you outside of this platform, you've mentioned that you're working with cooperatives. So can you just unpack that a bit more and share what your reach is and how are you currently working together?
I think the first thing is we created a new organization called FEED, which is Food Equity, Equality, Democracy, really looking at a collaborative, system-based, circular economy-based approach to the food system. And yes, you know, as Rori was saying, that system thinking tab, you know, that's probably, you know, a very key pillar. Is trying to address just the smallholder farmers, or trying to address just people who need food, for example, doesn't actually, you know, you get stuck at other quadrants of that system. So you got to look at those things. But you know, our focus for a long time has been smallholder farmers and how can we unlock what they're doing to the greater South African community. You know, in South Africa, we've got about 40,000, you know, medium to larger commercial farmers, but smallholder farmers, we're looking at about 200,000, and subsistence farmers, about 2 million of them. You know, subsistence being they're producing for themselves, but you know, so you're looking at about, for us, it's like 2.2 million, you know, other farmers that should be contributing or could be contributing, who do have some skills to contribute to a larger food system topic, that are somehow left out for us out of that system. Does it answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah, yes, thanks. And I think just to build on that, Rory, when you look at the food systems and, you know, everyone spoke about access now, how do we need to think about it from the different perspectives, from like suburban to township to rural? What are the differences and what's the same?
Tough question, Les. I think I'll share from, you know, from my perspective. I think, you know, the first thing is that, you know, it all starts at the production level, and that's largely the same. Somebody has to put the stuff into the ground, and it needs to grow, and then it needs to be distributed. I think what we found is that across the board, whether it's small or large, the biggest thing is access to just and equitable markets for that. You know, we've done a bit of work on trying to understand, for instance, the fresh produce value chain, whether it is going into the formal or the informal. You know, 90% of the value gets captured at the last mile distribution leg of the value chain, right? So your farmer really, who's doing probably the most value added work and input, captures a very, very small slice of the value, and 90% or over 90% gets captured in the last mile non-value adding type activities. And basically what happens is that those that provide convenience are the ones that ultimately capture the lion's share of the value, to the detriment of the consumer. So across both suburban and rural systems, I think that the big thing is, how do we make value chains, particularly food value chains, more just and equitable? And not necessarily, I'm not necessarily coming at this from let's call it a social warrior type of approach. I just think that, you know, that is where the space of entrepreneurs comes in. It is the role of entrepreneurs to capture areas of excessive margin and to distribute them and redistribute them differently. And I think the big blight on our entrepreneurial ecosystems and our tech ecosystems is that our focuses have not been on those particular areas that are going to drive that unlocking. We seem to have it's our turn to eat type of approach to wanting to tackle these issues. Is as long as I can find a way of also eating, it's fine, as opposed to saying, well, you know, your margin is my opportunity. You know, if you're a big retailer and you are capturing 90% of the value, that is an opportunity for me to build something that is really meaningful. So yeah, I would say the big things, Les, whether in the formal or the informal, by the way. So in our analysis, most of the value gets captured by the informal traders or the formal traders. And the fact that we don't really have, you know, the market forces don't do what they're supposed to do. You know, for those that believe in free market capitalism, you would then expect that market forces would drive down prices, for instance, which would then enable accessibility. But we have cartel type behavior within the distribution chains, both in the formal and the informal. So market forces, there isn't sufficient competitive dynamism that then drives the prices downwards. And apart from that, the hyper concentration of capital and power within small pockets within the value chain means that even if the forces are there, they are undermined simply because a lot of the capital and thus the ability to actually shift the system sits within small pockets. So I think if we had to say what is the prevailing issue across informal, formal, that is what we've at least come across.
And do you use that also a policy issue when you look at blending markets with food justice?
No, you know, I'm not big on I think that up to a point you can put policies in place. I think that, you know, to the extent that we're able to drive an entrepreneurial culture, you know, I put a lot of trust and maybe to my detriment in the ability of entrepreneurs to introduce new ways of doing things that fundamentally break old paradigms. And I think, yes, it may be a policy issue in parts, but for me to externalize it as a policy issue almost, it's almost relieves me of the responsibility. So to the extent that I can't do much about the policy issue, what's my part to play? And I think my part to play, the area in which I have control is, it is a policy issue, and it's an issue of us not focusing on entrepreneurial and our capital resources in the areas that are going to drive the greatest leverage with regards to this particular issue.
So, Kevin, you want to come in there? I see your hand.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the entrepreneurial side of it. You know, I think we've come out quite, you know, relatively strongly on that. And so again, in our experience, we're definitely in favor of entrepreneurialism, but I think there's added legs to that. And one of the things we think would help with that is more collaboration. We're a big, you know, pusher of cooperatives as well. And really looking at things like platform cooperatives, where people can create markets online, you know, where 100, 1,000 entrepreneurs come together and start to collaborate, because there are systemic issues that are affecting many entrepreneurs. You know, a simple example would be, you know, 10 restaurants coming together to form a delivery service. There's no reason you have to necessarily rely on somebody else to do that. You know, a delivery service isn't the hardest thing to run. So definitely in favor of the entrepreneurs, but I think in order to actually manage and overcome the market forces, you know, I worked with smallholder farmers, and you know, to use another example is, you could farm, you can get the best produce ever, and then you decide, okay, great, I've done this, I've created everything, let me take it to market, and then you can't get a price no matter how good your product is. But the point is, if 100 smallholder farmers are doing the same thing, if 200 smallholder farmers are, you know, doing the same thing, surely, you know, they need something to break that. And one is, yes, to employ government, as you say, create some policy to do that. Those efforts haven't worked, you know, in the last 25 years. What should work is rather a bottom-up approach of saying, well, let's get together and find a solution for this. Can we grow the same breed of tomatoes, 200 of us, and take it to market? Or can we create one website for 200 of us the way we can sell our produce? You know, those solutions really demand some more collaboration, while still maintaining the entrepreneur spirit in what you're doing exactly.
So, thank you. Namhla, having worked at various points of the food ecosystem, like from the profit motive and industrial farming to working with smallholder farmers, or at least with smaller traditional farmers, where do you see the opportunity to redistribute value?
Look, I think collaboration, number one. I mean, we can't overemphasize, you know, this topic in terms of collaboration. That, you know, you've got your large commercial scale farmers that, if we can partner with the small farmers, we can actually create a really equitable value, you know, or value in whatever that we are producing. So I think the biggest thing is collaboration. I do, however, want to go back to the previous point that we were discussing in terms of, you know, the entrepreneurial contributions and so on. So if we look at what actually drives, you know, our food insecurity in our country, as I said earlier, is not so much that we don't have the food, or we are not secure, but there is also, where we have the food, there's quite a lot of food waste and also the loss in the value chain. So we need to understand the full value chain in terms of what really happens in the value chain, and how best do we, or what technologies can we come up with that can actually curb or reduce the food waste, as well as the food loss that happens in the chain. So those are the things that, you know, if I read the report that was done by the WWF on food loss and waste, it is said there that the estimates, they suggest that 1/3 of all food in South Africa is never consumed and simply ends up in landfills, adding further pressure to an already overextended waste disposal system. So those are the things that we need to look into as a country. So from an entrepreneurial initiatives, those we need to look at, other than the price and the value, but what can we do to try and reduce the waste in the value chain and reduce the losses in the value chain? And it's not only, you know, retailers, and it's not only producers that are actually responsible for food security, but it's also us as consumers and as also household managers. How do we shop? We need to change our shopping behaviors or our shopping patterns. You know, do we actually stick to the list of what we need in the home, or just impulse buying? Because all of those things are actually pushing up, you know, the issue of food waste from a food security point of view.
Les, sorry, can I jump in on just some of the things that have been said? I definitely agree, and maybe just to contradict myself on whether we need policy interventions, I think an area that could be really impactful as far as policy intervention is in the competition law type space, because, you know, to the extent that you have these food producing monopolies and these food distributing monopolies, it undermines any efforts that any entrepreneur would ever try to do. And so I think that there's definitely a need for us to begin to break some of the anti-competitive practices that are happening within the food distribution and food supply sector. And, you know, I think to Kevin's point, nothing much has happened, you know, in all these years. That particular issue isn't really moving in any substantial ways, and I think it calls us as citizens. It calls for us as citizens to really ask ourselves why it is that something that is, you know, should be rather simple. You know, there's very clear issues here around monopoly, around the ability of prices to shift, price gouging and all of those things. Why are those things not being effective? And I think to Namhla's point, the other issue I think that we have is that, you know, first of all, I think we're very bad at demand estimation as consumers. So the fact that we are terrible at demand estimation is driving a lot of this food waste. And so for entrepreneurs and techies, you know, are there ways and opportunities there around just getting all of us to be better at demand estimation? And not just demand estimation, but I mean, you go out to a restaurant and and portion sizes are like, you know, we're always taking takeaways and so on. So there's clearly a dynamic there that also needs to be challenged. But I also think that, you know, a lot of the profit and revenue pools sit in the 1%. And so the incentive for anyone that is producing food and distributing food is to focus on the 1% where most of the profit and revenue pools sit, and ignore the 99%, just to use it as a metaphor, where the accessibility and affordability issues sit. And I think that's another missed opportunity for entrepreneurs and techies, in the sense that so if you look at, for instance, a lot of the investment in food tech is really just driving convenience. You know, food delivery, farm to fork, and so on. And I think the missed opportunity is that in using convenience as the vector of innovation and development, we're missing the opportunity for using affordability and accessibility as the vectors of innovation. And I think there's a huge opportunity in that particular area. But, you know, when we all start doing our business plans, we ask, where's the customer? Who's got the buying power? And so we all then decide to concentrate our efforts on the 1% as opposed to the 99% that really need it.
Are you seeing any advances in food access that gives you hope? Any best practice that we can hop on? Rori, I'll just stick with you on that question for a second.
I am and I'm not. And sorry to use a very cliched example in the space of entrepreneurship and tech, but the best example is Uber, and not for the reasons that you might think, not Uber Eats as such, but if you think about what the role, so Uber has basically given us a heuristic for how it can be done, and I think that is the advance that I would try to focus on, which is Uber went into a market where the profits and the revenues were concentrated in particular places, and Uber's role really was to take that, capture it for itself, and distribute it differently. And I think as far as a model for how we might be able to drive accessibility, if we are able to build the types of businesses that are able to go into these value chains, capture the value and redistribute it differently, and still be sustainable, then we're onto something. The thing about Uber is that they're not sustainable, right? They're making huge losses. And I think that is where the complexity sits, is who is going to be able to do that in a way that then allows you to also be sustainable. Within the food sector, I haven't seen anything that I can point at and say specifically, well, that is something. A lot of the things that we are seeing are great at a small scale, but are simply not scalable. And I think the big issue is food security is an issue of broad scale, and our interventions are typically interventions of deep scale, narrow, deep scale. And we need to find a way of figuring out how to achieve both the deep and the broad scale in our pursuits.
Sure. Thank you, Kevin. I'm gonna ask you to come in here, and maybe if I could ask you to share some of the ethos of Glory, the restaurant, and why you guys started it, because I mean, I am curious around this question around, deep scale versus broad.
Look, I think, and I'll start talking broader and sort of take over from where Rory sort of left off. And some of the answers, I see there's a question on the Q&A, I think came up as well on we have a lot of small scale farmers and subsistence farmers, yet what's missing if we have this food insecurity, but some of the solutions, and this is where something like Glory comes in, is really firstly a culture shift. And I think two broad things for me is culture and technology. Firstly, culture shift, just trying to create a broader food culture in the country, and not just for the rich 1%, where it's on Facebook and everyone's taking nice pictures or Instagram of their food, but a real food culture that embraces indigenous food, that embraces our own food and holds it dear and holds it valuable. And starting to progress with those foods and saying, look, this is South Africa, this is what we believe. And it's a multicultural democracy, of course, that we have. So, which makes it even more vibrant. We have so many, I love Joburg because of all the different cultures in Johannesburg. What we tried to do with Glory was really use smallholder farmers, in Gauteng, to look at different food cultures from around the world and see what we can draw from it. We're currently settled on Southeast Asian because we're finding a lot of value in that, but we have German menus, Indian menus, Peruvian, and we explore different cultures to in our test kitchen to really learn what people are doing around the world. So, for example, if you have this chili, what are they doing it in South America? What are they doing it in India, in Thailand, in China? And sort of bring those different flavors together to see how they can complement. Ultimately, what we're doing, though, is developing products that can be grown locally from local farmers, then beneficiated to make, let's say, a chili sauce. So if you're exploring chilies, what you're ultimately getting, yes, you're getting a chili sauce that you can serve in a restaurant that people get accustomed to, but ultimately you can start to bottle it and say, okay, here's a product we can sell to the rest of the world. So that was really the idea behind Glory was, yes, it's a restaurant, but the founding principle behind it was really to say, well, what can we grow locally and how do we use that product once we grow it? And I think that's where the question of sort of culture comes in is, it's not just about growing it. When you start to have the pride about it, you want people to come here from all over the world to eat it here, to have a look at it, not just for ourselves, but for other people as well. and hopefully that gets beneficiated as well, so we can export it to other countries, not just as a raw produce, but as something more than that. So I think once you get young people and the pride and the culture going, particularly in townships and rural areas, when people are cooking up stuff and trying to outdo maybe each other, and this entrepreneurial spirit comes out of it, where people are trying to create products out of what they have. Maybe that's what I'm looking for is how do you enable that? How do you get there? And I think that's part of the solution for me, is we can look at this food insecurity as this very shame, we have to help people, and oh dear, it's a problem. Or we can look at it as how do we help ourselves in a very enabling way to get out of this, and not waiting for government or anybody else to try and solve this, but creating the emphasis at the bottom of our societies at the individual level to be able to do that.
Sure. So that blend of cuisine, food culture, and food security.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think something will come out of there, and I think, sorry, I hope I'm not taking too long with this, but I'm almost like, I cried for, I moved to Joburg in 2000, so it's been 20 years now. And I've always cried because, I see tourists come here from all over the world, and they always have asked me, but why do we have to go to Sandton, or why do we have to go to Rosebank to eat? And where's the local cuisine? Why do I have to get fake Italian? Or, there's some good Italian restaurants, not to knock anybody, but why, where's the local cuisine? Why can't I find it elevated in a beautiful first class restaurant, but local, or why is my hotel telling me I can't go to a township to taste local cuisine? And why is it so hard for a foreigner to access it, to know somebody who's come here? So I mean, those are some of the challenges. And I somehow think if you can get that right, yes, I'm talking about a tourist market, but if you're starting to do that, then you start to create different chains in townships and rural areas to enable that. And I think that starts to add a little more, maybe get some farmers from subsistence more interested in growing other stuff that gets them more funds and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Namhla, I saw your hand up. I have a follow-up question with you, but do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I do want to add to say we must just also take into cognizance your NPOs, like your Food for South Africa or the food banks, in terms of food security, because we still need to get to the areas where retailers can't get to, but the food still needs to get to the people. So, and you've got people that are not able to access the food because of all the socioeconomic challenges that they have. So, the technology that we need to come up with, as a nation or as entrepreneurs, also needs to, be inclusive of your NPO sectors, and that technology also needs to allow also, for cost-effective scaling, from a reduction of cost, that so that we can be able to reach further. Because you must remember, from an NPO point of view, we're not making any profits. We just want to get the food as quickly as possible to where it needs to be, and as reasonably costed as can be, because we are heavily reliant on donations and on the kindness of companies and people. So I just think, I needed to just raise that point, that from a food security point of view, that the NPOs also need to be looked after from a tech innovation. Yeah.
So, thank you. And I'm just staying with you. I mean, also kind of following up on the conversation that we're having with Kevin. I mean, will the idea of having like organic food stay at the elite bourgeois, seemingly bourgeois level of society? I mean, during lockdown, I've been asking people to send me pictures of their hampers, or at least like, what do I put in, asking for advice about what I put into a hamper when I'm making donations. And again, like for me, many of it lacked nutrition, but it was the whole thing about like filling bellies. What are the considerations when you're working with different corporates and suppliers who are giving food towards food forward?
So we are obviously looking for nutritious food, and we don't specify to say that it has to be organic or just conventional food. It needs to be nutritious food. And I think when it comes to organic, it's a whole arena of, when we talk about organic, because I don't think from a food technologist point of view that everybody understands, or a lot of people understand what organic food means, or what it means to produce organic food at the scale that we need it at. A lot of people would have questions from a retail space to say, why is the organic bananas more expensive than the conventional ones? It is in the way that it is grown, and it is also, the risks that have to be taken into account, and just also you don't have a lot of options when you have to grow organically and at that scale. So it does become a very expensive way of growing the food in that aspect from a retail point of view. So if I take it back to your question with regards to Food Forward South Africa, as I said, we don't specify that it must be organic food. We are always in search for nutritious food from the different companies. And I think the different companies that are actually supporting us in that way, they do understand what our mission is that our mission is to have a South Africa without hunger. And how we're going to do that is making sure that we produce, or we donate nutritious food and also safe food, because that's another aspect that from a food security point of view, you've got to take the food safety aspect of it. With no safe food, you don't have any food security. So it starts also with the safe food that you are actually donating, or that you are actually supplying to the people, that it is microbially safe, and that it will not be causing any illness to the people. So those are also just the things that have to be taken into account when we talk about donating food to those that are in need.
Okay, so Rory, please clear up my confusion. Thank you. So on the one hand, we've been saying now a few times that South Africa is a food secure country, and huge issues around access. We've also said that the value is really at the last mile. Now, how does this all fit into the fact, especially if we've got food, into my grocery basket being less and less for the same rand value when I go to Pick n Pay? Like, why is food so expensive, and how do we meet current household or reducing household income?
Yeah, another tough one, Des. Yeah, I think, well, let's maybe look at some of the drivers of price inflation, and particularly food price inflation, right? So on the one hand, what I would guess is that wherever you're buying things that, one, there's a lot of investment in brand, both for the food itself and for the particular store that you're buying from. And so a lot of the price inflation is driven by just brand, and then two, processing it in just the right way so that it is particularly convenient for you, so you don't have to go and peel a pumpkin when you get home. And so the processing also becomes a big driver of price inflation. And then you've got your distribution and your logistics. And there, really, I think the big variable is the price of your primary input, being fuel. But the other thing that can't be ignored is the cost of capital, and how the cost of capital becomes a big driver then of costs within the broader organizational or business system. Because if I'm having to acquire a truck, for instance, and I have to acquire that truck at a particular rate of interest, that particular cost and the rate of interest sets almost like a hurdle that I have to cross with the type of pricing that I then put on the food. So as I was saying earlier, for instance, fresh produce, the fresh produce increases by close to 300% in price. Like an average basket of fresh produce increases by 300% in price from the farmer to your hands. And if you study that, a lot of it is really just driven by the cost of having to service the capital that distributes it or gets it to you. It is not value additive. It's the same cabbage that got out of the ground that you're going to buy at your retailer. And the primary thing is this entire network, this entire distribution network, and how capital intensive it is, begins to be a big driver. And in an environment where you have your fuel costs rising, that also begins to increase. And then here's the kicker: when you have, you know, the less mechanized the process as well, and you've got people involved, the cost of paying people involved, that keeps rising. And of course, that continues to rise, right? Every single year, you have to provide them with salary increases to match inflation. And so as the cost of your people continues to rise, you need to continue to service that. And so your basket is getting smaller and smaller, not because the food is getting better and better, but because the costs of getting the food to you are increasing more and more. And the contradiction in that, if you're socially orientated, is that, you know, you remove the people, now there's unemployment, and how do you deal with that? Even if you look at your informal traders account for 60% of demand at the Joburg fresh produce market, for instance, right? So it's a huge employment or livelihood creator for them. But they capture all of that. They capture a lot of it as just profit for themselves. And what drives that is that the cost of living is particularly high, and so they need to capture a lot more value in what they're selling. And so it would seem that a lot of the things that are driving your basket being smaller and smaller are not food issues, as there are broader macroeconomic issues that also require and call for us to think innovatively around.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Rory, and that's quite painful to hear. So, Kevin, I'll allow for your reflection on that, but I also have a question for all of you before we take other questions, and that's basically how can we use data? And I know we alluded to it, but I would love to hear more solutions just around how we can use technology to be applied for a transformative shift, primarily for the food insecure.
Yeah, thanks, Lesley. Thanks for bringing me in there. You know, firstly, we actually sit on a few of the working groups on agroecology South Africa, which deals with organic farmers, small organic farmers in the country, and organic type issues. And it's interesting. I actually sit on the data forum for that, on the data working group. So we're looking at some of these issues. But you know, we currently, you know, there's about 190 organic or I use the term loosely, which I'll explain now, farmers that we have in our database around the Gauteng area predominantly. So there's some smaller farmers doing it. I was out at Civic in Bez Valley last week, for example, and they're doing it. You know, a lot of the organic type farmers are moving to peer review models, so they can review each other to see, well, are they keeping to whatever is required, which brings the cost down. And Civic can even chop up your vegetables for you if you want it. So one of the bigger issues though ends up, regardless, is you still don't have market access to do anything with it. You know, how many people know about all the organic, you know, all the farms in Joburg City, CBD? There's quite a few. You know, I can go to 20 plus, and on rooftops and in gardens and so on and so forth. But it's just hard for them to break into anything from there. You know, the markets work a certain way, and that is, it gets transported from all over the country to these big sort of markets like Joburg Market. It gets redistributed there. Or if you're lucky enough, you get a contract directly with Woolworths or directly to export, where most of it goes. So the lines of flow work a certain way. And so you might have a farm in Soweto, for example, or around that area, and someone might take it, you know, directly to an informal trader on the street and get whatever for that, or otherwise it's going to Joe Market and might get transported back to the supermarket, the larger supermarkets there, which adds that extra mile and extra cost. I actually think, you know, what I'm missing for me again is you introduced me to, for example, to Mustafa Amin, which is Breadfast in Egypt. And that's a good, you know, example. You know, they sell fresh produce. They started selling bread, but now they're doing more fresh produce. around Cairo. That's where they started, but they've got some major investment in. And the reason why is because the world now is not looking for solutions for that 1% anymore, as much as, yes, there are people looking for it. But I think where we're missing a beat in this country is that, and where I see Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt taking the lead in this, is looking for solutions that everybody else who needs it, including those food insecure people. How do we use technology to address the problems of the world and to address the underserved or unserved communities? I think that really needs to be the question. And what I'm missing though is that for entrepreneurs, man, that's where the real opportunity is. Why is Breadfast getting a lot of money? Read up about Breadfast and see what they're, how well they're doing. Because if you can get it right in this country, you can roll it out to the rest of the continent. You can roll it out to all China, India, Indonesia, you name those countries. So the real activity and the real opportunities on this planet for entrepreneurs is the same issues that we're facing with this food insecurity actually presents an opportunity to address it. And I think technology can address it. And why can it address it? Is because technology allows you to aggregate and to simplify things that would otherwise, if you did it manually, be so much harder to address. You're talking about billions and billions of people in this country that you want to address. But the only way to sort of aggregate it and make it simpler for us to actually digest and to work with is to use technology. So it's an opportunity for me.
Sure. And I have a follow-up, but I'll hold it for now. Namhla, what are the other leverage points that you're seeing?
I think we definitely need some sort of a centralized app, and of course I'm no IT guru or anything, but I know that if we could have some sort of a centralized app of some sort, that would be of great assistance. But the challenges that we're going to sit with is who is going to be doing it, and who, I'm looking at it from a point of the issues that we have from the potential red tape around it. That if we say that there is a central app that's going to manage all of these needs and requests from actually getting the food to where it's needed, we're gonna have to really rise up as a country in terms of, or whoever that does it, in terms of ethical response, or making sure that we're actually quick to answer the questions, or to answer to the needs of the poor. So putting together a technology, it's gonna need us to be very, very quick and be on the pulse in terms of what is actually needed. The food is needed now, and to the place, to wherever the areas or the challenging areas that needs to get to. So I think we have to have one as an idea, is to say, let's have a centralized app to consolidate what is needed, and that's just my take from a technology point of view.
So thank you for that. And Kevin, I'm going to come back to you now. I see your hand is raised. There's two opportunities I just want to raise here, and I'd love all of you to perhaps give your reflection on it from an entrepreneurial perspective. So the one is, I've been having conversations for the past few years with especially the mining industry to look at what are secondary industries they can create, because mines are on the decline. And agribusiness has been coming up quite a bit. So there's one opportunity there. We've also had SANSA at those conversations, South African National Space Agency, and I've met with them, and they're very keen to freely distribute data that they have, and they wanted to go downstream to entrepreneurs, for entrepreneurs to innovate. The third opportunity I want to speak to is, and Geshe said earlier, I serve on the advisory panel of the 4R Commission for the Premier's Office. And there are conversations about having a national data center. And one of the issues again is how we process data. It's one thing having data, but it's the second thing knowing how to process and make it usable. So there are these initiatives, and like I say, it's about us, collaboration came up a few times about creating those smarter solutions with these various points of opportunity. So Kevin, I would just love to get your reflection on that. And if you know of any engagement with various industries that we can already pull in.
Yeah, I think I've been working in Magaliesburg for quite a few 4 or 5 years now, and really looking at an area, Rustenburg, such an interesting phenomenon, because of course the platinum mines, and then I've worked with the platinum mines for 10, 15 years. 10 years quite permanently. I used to have offices there. So it's an interesting phenomenon because Rustenburg was one of the best orange growing, citrus growing regions in the world. And when the mines, when platinum was discovered, when they moved in, for me, it was just such high quality. South Africa has high quality citrus, and they were producing such a great quality, from what I hear. And of course, platinum discovered, and water's polluted, and you can't do it. And it didn't actually necessarily; those mines didn't necessarily benefit local communities as much of the labor was, was migrants, so they moved in from other areas and so on and so forth. So you see this issue and this conundrum now as platinum, changes and the markets change for and the demand for it changes. So definitely, there's a benefit in cleaning up those environments and making it useful. The river next to a farm that we're working on, you can't use the water because the water is polluted. So if you put it in your land use, you're damaging your land. You have to use bore water that comes from another source. So I think, again, I've seen other countries do it, and I think South Africa moving to this broader, more than 40,000 commercial farmer type of environment, to a broader food culture, a broader food economy, would really benefit the country, because if we start to make it less extractive and more regenerative, I see the comments coming in, it has a longer term for it. The mining hasn't lasted that long actually, but if you looked after the land and stuff for the local community, they could have been far better, more beneficial. And we would have had a longer thing that would still be continuing for generations to come. Now, we've lost that opportunity, and now we have to clean up. But even in the cleaning up, there would be that opportunity, I think. We're currently looking at that river and thinking, well, is there some plants and some organic way that we can use that would actually help to filter out all the toxins that are in the water? And we're currently, very keen on taking that project forward. So I think looking at things like that would be great. I just one quick point on the previous comments was, I think in terms of data, we almost, and even in terms of entrepreneurship, we almost have to define what is infrastructure. And I think in the new digital age, infrastructure is not just roads and airports and whatever the case is. It's also digital infrastructure, like access to data that's relatively cheap, widely available, but also some access to central information or something of that sort. The challenges around privacy, the Experian incident happened recently, where 25 million people say it was stolen or taken. We have to put measures in place to address that. But I think part of the infrastructure, do I as an entrepreneur have to build a database of smallholder farmers I can address, or can I get access to that in some mechanism?
Thank you. You've touched on a sensitive topic there that's also a question. So Rori, just so you can think about it at the back of your mind while I speak to Namhla first, land grabs, land security, bring your whole philosophical and your every hat in for that question, please. How does that tie into food security? But Namhla, there's questions here, and Kevin spoke about data now, and data keeps recurring. And if I look at the questions here, there's a question around, the digital divide and, how it's exacerbating the situation. There was a question there around, the role of civil society organizations and NGOs implementing solutions. My question to you is, what is this? Is there a gap, and how wide is the gap for NGOs and civil society organizations being able to use data? Do we first need to upskill to a large extent? Is that just an assumption? Or how do we bring NGOs into this conversation already?
I think, when it comes to the information or the knowledge or the data, there is information in every sector. So government has information, business sector has information, households have information, NGOs have information. But the challenge that we have is, transferring that information to a point where it is needed and for everybody to be able to access. And when we talk about the lack of data, we're talking about, the lack of data on the causes, of the food security in a particular area, the volumes, the hotspots in the food chain, in the food value chain, they remain a challenge. And that also requires a collective action, as well as, I'd say, reporting transparency. So we're sitting with our own data, and we would like to. There is definitely a gap, so that needs to be bridged between all the sectors that are dealing with this issue in understanding how best do we service the communities from an NGO point of view. And the only way we can get that is when we're having, a point of collection of this data where we understand where the needs are, what is needed, and in how much volumes of that. So I don't know if I'm answering the person's question.
Sure. You are answering it, and I think, something that's also just came up to me, and I'd love to think further on this maybe in a future conversation, just in terms of like, how do we start getting computational thinking to NGOs to be able to tap into existing opportunities a bit more?
I think it will take some. It will take also, the communities to actually get, to reach the the NGOs, or the NGOs coming out to where the communities are, to understand where the need is. But from a technology point of view, I'm thinking now, off the top of my head, if there's somebody who's sitting in Kumbu, Transkei, and I don't know, they don't have access to any technology, how do we reach them? Those are just the questions that, because you are sitting there with issues of, food insecurity, and you want to reach there, but you don't know how far the need is or what it is that is needed in there, and how do I get there? And this is where I think government has got that kind of, a level of infrastructure to understand where the needs are, and they need to be in consultation with the NGOs to say that there is a need here, this is what is needed, and how best can we then service those areas.
Awesome. Thank you. Rory, another tough question. Is there an impact on food security? Like, does land grabs have an impact on food security?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Just before that, I think the issue on data is quite interesting, because I think that there's maybe other ways that we might look at it. I don't see a world in the short to medium term where we're able to reach everybody and to build a database, and then once we have the database, to keep it up to date. If we don't apply different ways of trying to get to that data, and I wonder whether we shouldn't be thinking about, for instance, after I get off this call, I'm sure if I jump onto Facebook, Facebook is going to inundate me with food security things. They figured out how to track and trace me across the whole internet, and I think we should be able to use predictive modeling, for instance, to begin to help us to identify these spots without NGOs having to go there themselves and so on. I think there are other ways that we need to try and start thinking about in terms of how we identify, and integrate with, for instance, your mobile network operators, avenues that are already getting the data of people, and then being able to do some predictive modeling based on, cell phone usage behavior, maybe as a variable, even location and so on, and then start to say, we can, with a high level of predictability, we can determine which areas of the country are most food insecure and so on, and therefore that is where we should focus our resources. I think that we do have to push ourselves in that regard, because I think the challenge that I'm hearing on the data thing is that it doesn't sound like we have done a solid enough job in terms of building a business case and an investment case around data. I mean, there should be a business opportunity there if we dig in, but we're probably not thinking about it as an opportunity. Somebody's going to go and capture that opportunity, and then even our own data on food security is ultimately going to be in the hands of somebody else if we don't think creatively about that. As far as land grabs, yeah, you're putting me on the spot here, and I guess I'm going to say a few things, some of them may be controversial. and I hope they age well in this infinite internet. The first thing is, I think, personal opinion, the idea that there will be absolute land restitution is a noble lie. That you know, to borrow from Socrates, he speaks of the noble lie. And the noble lie is basically a lie that the elite tell everybody else just to keep social harmony. And I think that the idea that we're going to get to you know, land restitution is a noble lie, irrespective of which party, by the way, is in power. And I think that is so because the systemic interdependencies of getting it right are so fraught with risks and so on that that it would just be very difficult for anyone to try and pull it off and still want to keep their Gucci shoes. So so in that regard, I think that I don't see that happening in the ways that we imagine it. And I'm not making a value judgment here on whether that is right or wrong. I'm simply saying, you know, what's my perception of what the medium to long-term trajectory on this particular issue is. On the second point, I guess the question is, if land restitution aids or does not aid food security, we have to ask ourselves, so are current land use patterns and land ownership patterns optimizing for food security? And so my response to that would probably be no, but not necessarily maybe for the reasons that one would say that, well, you know, it's in the hands of the few and so on. I get that. So if we're talking about large scale food production, I think the big issue is, you know, if you speak to farmers, the biggest constraint is the capital to work that land. And so you have farmers that are then forced or pushed to produce, you know, high margin type things that are going to generate the most profit for them and produce them for markets where they can sell them at the best profits. And in that way, it drives food insecurity because there is no incentive to try and feed the whole country necessarily, right? So in that way, it does, or the current land use patterns and land ownership patterns do drive food insecurity. So the question, if land grabs or land redistribution would aid that, I think rests on whether it would, the capital that enables that would behave differently. You know, once Rori now owns the land, is he going to be driven by feeding the nation, or is he also just going to be driven by trying to get the optimal return for his piece of land? You know, we all have our political ideologies, but at the end of the day, it sounds like the one we all consistent on is mammon, and mammon as a big driver of the decisions that we ultimately make. And I am not convinced, when I look at just human behavior, that Rori, without a coercive force from somewhere, would make different decisions about how he would use that land beyond just maybe feeding himself, whether he would decide that he's going to forego the big margins that sit in gooseberries and instead he's going to grow spinach and somehow resolve that. And of course, the big thing is that once you've solved the land issue, then there's the issue of the distribution. And where most people live is not where most of the land is. And so the distribution issue would remain, and that would then be, you know, an issue of, okay, so we've got people producing. There are still going to be people that won't be able to access that produce unless we deal with that too. So maybe a roundabout way of addressing it, but I don't necessarily think that land grabs and so on impact or don't impact food security. I think it is the behavior and the underpinning motivation of the providers of capital and the owners of that capital that ultimately determine whether we'll have food security or not.
Thank you. Ms. Namhla, I see a question around youth employment opportunities, but I actually want to broaden that question. So, and I kind of feel bad posing this question to the obvious person who's possibly affected. Race, gender, youth. Where and how do we bring more diversity and opportunity in the food value chain? You're on mute.
Sorry. I think the first thing that I always advocate for, even when I'm having just general conversations, is that if we want to get into the food and agri space, the first thing that we need to understand is the full value chain of the food and agri space. So I think a lot of times when we talk about food security, we're only just focusing on the primary production, which is the farming part of it. But there's other things that are happening before the farming. I mean, who's producing the seeds? You know, who is doing the seedlings, for instance, for the farmer? Who is supplying the fertilizers? And so understanding that full value chain and not only focus on the farming aspect of the food and agri space. So from a youth and, from a youth perspective, I think we need to first broaden our eyes in terms of looking beyond the farming space, that what other aspects or what other areas in the value chain can we actually play in. So I think that for me is the overall of where our focus should lie and where we should be actually making a difference in. I mean, the session that we at now is talking about technology. You know, if we're talking about precision farming, we're talking about technology there. You know, who does the spraying machines? Who does the engineering side of it? You know, so all of those things, that it's not only just, you know, I own a farm and I'm just putting seeds on the ground, but what actually happens in the full value chain. So let's investigate the full value chain. I think that would be my message to the youth. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. I'm so tempted to ask my own question, but let me be disciplined and follow the questions. Yeah. Kevin, I'll pose this question to you. In your view, is there sufficient access and support for smallholder farmers, access to financial services sector, actually?
Interesting question. And unfortunately, it is a broader question. You know, it's but let me keep it as short as possible. By saying it like this is, you know, I've seen a lot of activity for smallholder farmers, for youth wanting to get into farming, in terms of training, in terms of even access to capital, so on and so forth. Those things can always improve, but you know, and encouraging entrepreneurial type farmers in the youth. I've seen a lot of activity over the last 20 years or so, particularly in the last 10 years, and I've seen some great projects do that. The problem comes in with the system itself, because you can do that at that point in the value system, but you can't get out of that value system. You're stuck in the way it works. And if you don't have access to more than that, what is more than that if you don't have access to logistics, packaging, marketing, markets itself, business insights, market insight into what to grow, what produce, so on and so forth. It becomes a very, isolating endeavor. And that's what I've found with many farmers, is you get stuck in this hole of, yes, I've done it, it's great, you said this will work. And then what I found to address those things, people then said, okay, cool, let's teach our farmers social media skills, marketing skills. But again, that wasn't the right solution for me. Yes, some of them learned how to market and they found better markets and all of that, but you can't be the farmer and do this and do that and do 100 different things. You have to have a market that actually enables you. So it's no use just addressing the farmer and saying, okay, cool, I've given you all the tools you need to farm, including capital and training and even equipment and land. But that's not enough. And unfortunately, it's a systemic issue. So if you're not creating this enabling environment for that person, not just to do that one bit, but but more so throughout the rest of the value chain. It's very difficult and leads to a lot of failures and a lot of frustration.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can one of you, any of you, please tell us what conversation we should be having about seeds in this country? What should we really be fearing, and where should we be investing?
So I think if we're talking about where we should be investing, I think we should be investing in the making of the seed, the production of the seeds. Okay, so how do we make seeds? Where do we make seeds? What kind of operations do we require in order for us to make our own seeds? And what seeds are required? What are we consuming in South Africa the most that we can actually make our own seeds, in the country? So it could be that we do have those, but I don't think we have enough. We still need to invest in that space of seed cultivation. So those are the opportunities that are there when it comes, to seed making.
Yeah. Thank you. And then my final round. Oh, go for it, Rori.
If I may just add, I think the domain of seeds is a domain of just IP as well. And I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of how you make sure that we then protect that IP. And to the extent that we're not funding the development of that IP, then, if somebody else from outside the country, for instance, is funding the development of the IP, they then ultimately become the owners. And so I think there's a lot of work in terms of making sure that the policy environment around intellectual property and even just like global geopolitics and not being bullied by the larger countries enables us to hold on to our IP. And I think especially around some of the more indigenous varietals of seeds and so on, I think every now and then the world wakes up and realizes that Africa had it right all along. And so there's other varietals that we're probably right on right now that the world hasn't realized. And I think we need to be a lot faster in terms of being able to develop that IP, capturing that IP, and then building frameworks that can allow us to propagate that IP in responsible ways and in ways that are just for our country and our continent.
Thank you. Then my lightning round question to all the speakers is, you can literally respond to whatever you think I have not asked that I should have asked you, whatever's burning in your gut. What are your closing thoughts that you'd like to share with all of us? Kevin, I'm going to throw in a twist. I'm going to give you an extra as part of your closing thoughts. I'd love to hear, you've spent a lot of time looking at indigenous knowledge and traveled the continent exploring this. What lessons can we bring to this conversation around food security?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. Again, we almost need to look at it. Well, let me put it this way. We ran an experimental farming area on one of our farming projects, about 2 to 3 hectares, just getting seeds together, looking at things like cancer bush and different kinds of garlics and what would grow well in the Magaliesberg. There's a lot of value that we have there. I was working with a distiller, for example, in Wellington, and he would walk through the mountains around that area and just touch plants and smell them, and then start to play with them. And then he made his gin where he's got 15 different kinds of local indigenous flavors in there, including things like buku and confetti bush, for example, that maybe we know a bit more about. But so there's opportunity there, for one, from an economic perspective, to develop unique products. But in developing that, what's great about using local varietals is that it's made for our climate, it's made for our water conditions. So we won't need as much water as we're trying to push out now to farm things that come from elsewhere. So I think from an environmental perspective, there's a lot of value in doing it, not just because of the economics of it, but because it's from here, it's from us. It's a pride that where we have rooibos that only grows in this country, and and we should, you know, somehow more pride and more access to that, to say, this is our local stuff, world, have a look at this, or ourselves, wow, doesn't our local stuff taste great? So it's not just about the economic value of it, which is very important, of course, but also creating an environment and culture that's healthy for us, that that looks after our community and culture, that speaks of who we are as people. I think that will add value for a lot of people as well, and give a lot of self-worth to our youth. You know, maybe looking for symbols of something to give them self-value. Yeah. Can I and then on another thing, can I just say one thing on the land issue?
Yes, a very quick one, because we have 3 minutes left.
Very quick one. It's one thing that says, is food insecurity leading the land debate, or is the land debate a solution for food insecurity? And maybe it's a circular argument, but is food security part of the reason there is this debate about land? You know, which way is it? Yeah.
No, tough questions. Very, very tough. Ms. Namhla, closing thoughts, and I'm going to also add a spin to your closing thoughts. I give people closing thoughts, then I add my own. How do we, you know, as you're closing off, can you also give us insight, and maybe just closing off the thought around what lockdown and COVID has done to us? Like, how do we support households to absorb the shock, these shocks, be it climate change shocks or now the COVID shock?
You know, we always have to look at, you know, our neighbors. Let's not go too far. Look at next door as an example. Is there a need in your neighbors, you know, in your circles? Is there a need for food? Can we help where we can? So in terms of at a household level, what is my neighbor? Has my neighbor eaten today? Has my neighbor gotten something? Because a lot of people have lost jobs, they've lost income. You know, we don't know what they're going through. And sometimes some people are not able to say, you know, to lift up their hand and say, I need this. But let's be those South Africans that say, look, I baked something today. I made something, can we share? You know, you never know what problem you're solving, you know, or what food insecurity you are solving at that moment. So at a household level, let's understand let's get into our neighbor's space. Let's be those neighbors that don't wait for an invitation, but we say, let's share something, let's eat, you know, and without having to ask, do you need, have you got? Because we don't all have, you know, that gut to say, I lack this, I don't have this, I don't have that. You know, let's be South Africans of humanity. Ubuntu must come back. I know it sounds like a cliche, but it is the reality.
Thank you. And thank you for that. Thank you for bringing that back into the center. And I think it's a good moment to pass on to Rori, because I mean, what I know about Rori is that you pretty much made a career out of being a values-based citizen and a values-based leader. So I'll give you the closing word on that one.
Thanks, Les. Yeah, I think it's definitely true. We have to, you know, one of the things that's interesting, for instance, about Apple at the moment is how Apple has decided that they're going to build a profit base around the value of privacy. You know, and they're building an entire business ecosystem just around the value of privacy. You know, we will look after privacy when the rest of the sector will not, basically, and that's the pitch that they're making. And I think in many respects there's a missed opportunity, because we've got this thing called Ubuntu, which is very endemic to Africa. And we haven't yet figured out how to package it as a means to build solid businesses, and particularly, you know, different ways of being and of behaving of businesses. And the world's crying out for that. You know, if you look across the world, the riots and so on, they're crying out for an Ubuntu-based business model. And I'll be quick. I was at an event recently, and this guy was sharing a profound thought. He said, you know, Rori, you know, if I go into a court of law and I argue with this guy and I say that he did not, you know, he did not act in good faith. You know, the word for good faith is a Latin word. It's a Latin word, I'm forgetting it, I'm blanking on it, but you know, good faith, making a good faith argument in court can turn the decision. But I can't go there and say he did not behave in a manner that is befitting of Ubuntu and win the case. And how do we get to a stage where we institutionalize our values and they become the way in which we behave and the way in which we measure the businesses at an institutional level? So I think that's definitely something that the world is crying out for generally. I think on this particular topic, I think somebody said it's bona fides. On this particular topic, I think the big thing here is for me, or one of the things that we might want to look at, particularly as entrepreneurs in tech, is profitability is inversely proportional to nutrition and to accessibility. And so that inverse proportionality is actually the thing that we need to solve for, because until we make it profitable to drive accessibility and nutrition, these problems will continue to remain, not so much for the sake of money, but because the human motivation is a powerful thing in getting things done. And unless we tap into human motivation in the crudest way through the profit motive, these problems will continue to bedevil us. And so that is the problem that we need to be solving as techies, as entrepreneurs. And I would argue, just the last point is, let's step away from the computers a little bit. Let us go and understand the context and the system, because actually a lot of these solutions don't require like the most cutting edge technologies. They just need fresh insight, and you can use some of the more later stage technologies to resolve it once you've got the insight. Let's invest less in building the next algorithm, and let's invest more in getting fresh insights that we can use existing algorithms to solve.
Thank you, Rory. So to all of you, Namhla, Rori, Kevin, I really felt like I was sitting around my kitchen table, and I'm looking at my kitchen, so I'm not there, but I felt like we were friends sitting around the table discussing issues that are fundamental and critical to our nation at this moment in sub-Saharan Africa. So thank you for the effort you've made. Thank you for the pre-work you've done for this. You've all sent me quite a lot of material to dig in. So I hope I've got a lot of actions that I'm taking forward, but to attempt a summary on what was a rich conversation, I'll start with that end point is really take time to understand the problem. And there is this blend of high tech and low tech, but we need to be contextually relevant. There's a huge need for the role of tech in solutions building, and that's from looking at demand estimation, access, nutrition, the need for open source data and precision farming for both youth employment opportunities, but also primarily entrepreneurs. Have a look at the entire value chain. We looked at IP in the production of seeds, looked at smarter distribution channels. We need to look at how do we start packaging African solutions as value. From a technology perspective also, yeah, demand, access, nutrition, I spoke to that. Collaboration is key, that kept coming up. The role of the CBO and NGO is also important and should not be left behind. And there's a lot of thinking about how do we get knowledge, data, reporting, transparency to NGOs and CBOs. And I have a question mark here just around like what's the state of computational skills in the NGO sector that I'm quite curious about. And then we need to look for sustainable solutions. There is a role for policy around the competition space, especially looking at the value at the last mile. And I think, oh yes, land, which is always a contested space and a controversial question. But two key things we can already do while we're figuring out this land issue is try to look at how do we regenerate land and make it usable, but also optimize for food security. And final two super critical roles, how do we create Ubuntu-centered business models and also just be a good neighbor, which is a very low-hanging fruit that we can all do today. We know how we like starting things on Mondays. No, we can start that right now when we log off here, just check on our neighbor. So thank you. And with that, I'm handing back over to Geshe.
Thanks, Lesley, and thanks, everybody. I think this has really been an amazing conversation. I've just popped a question onto the chat group for everybody, attendees and panelists, perhaps as we leave, because I think we've been stimulated with sort of some big system issues, but also very, as Lesley was just saying, very organizational and human scale, whether tech or non-tech, roles that we play and that we can actually think about coming out of this conversation. So I'd just really like to thank you for that. The risk is obviously for me to reopen the whole conversation, so I'm going to try not to do that. But just to thank you for your time for the conversation. We will share this video as well as the supplementary transcripts from the chats and Q&A. So don't worry if we didn't get to everything. It was not humanly possible to do so. But hopefully this is this is a conversation among many, but also a conversation that's part of actions and interventions, ideas that we have to take forward in our various work. We really appreciate you being part of this, but please continue to be part of it. As the Civic Tech Network, I think what we can offer is ourselves as a network, as a space, as a conduit. So if there's anything you think that we can do to take any of the issues raised here today forward, please get in touch with us about that. And I guess with that, I'm just going to ask you all to please take a minute to leave a thought here, because we will try and curate this into some kind of an article or public statement coming out of this conversation. Lesley, we thank you for your round the dining table chat. Namhla, Kevin, Rory, thank you so much. I think you've stimulated us in ways we couldn't have paid for, and so thank God we didn't try. Thank you for offering your time to share with us like this. So please take a moment to chat. We'll ask the panelists to remain behind. Attendees, thank you and go well. Have an amazing weekend. Oh, it's not weekend yet. I guess week. Bye.
Wow, folks, that was good.
I'm supposed to be playing music now, but I'm slow. Hi all, I hope that was enough time for everybody to do their chats. We still have some attendees on. Melissa, would you mind closing the external part? Are you still there, Melissa?
I'm here, just trying to figure
I don't want to leave. I wish we actually had food now.
Exactly, that would be nice. I see Namhla has left. She might have had time issues. Oh, here you are, Namhla. You're back. Okay, your mic is off.
Let's all go meet at Glory.
Exactly.
That would be nice. That would have been a great idea, Kevin.
Absolutely, that would be great.
It is still a great idea. Let's go now.
Security event I hosted at Glory. We were the
Let's
opening event.
go.
Look at Rori. He's got nothing better to do. He's like, yeah, let's go now.
You're welcome to come
I
over.
do.
It's right next to my house in Melbourne.
Yes,
So I can walk over.
Geshe has already wished for a great weekend, so I'm assuming it's weekend.
you know, in my head, it just goes to show you the week I've had, but like the weekend is here. But guys, thank you so much. I mean, we really don't want to keep you longer. It's just an opportunity, I think, for any kind of reflection, any thoughts you might want to share with each other, or any complaints, anything like that, just as we check out.
On my side, I really have no complaints other than to say I'm really appreciative of the opportunity that you've afforded me to really talk about issues of food that are very close to my heart. I'm a foodie as well, Lesley. So yeah, thank you so much. That's all I can say. It was a great session and great learnings also from my side. And I mean, I took a lot from Rori as well as Kevin in terms of how to actually just put together this whole food security issue, you know, from different angles or different aspects or how other people are seeing it. Yeah, but yeah, thank you so much.
Nice. Thanks, Namhla.
Yeah, I think thanks from me as well. You know, the perspective that I come from is not, I don't rate it as far as having a